Poetic Edda is the modern attribution for an unnamed collection of Old Norse anonymous poems, which is different from the Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson. Several versions exist, all consisting primarily of text from the Icelandic medieval manuscript known as the Codex Regius. The Codex Regius is arguably the most important text and source on Norse mythology and Germanic heroic legends, and from the early 19th century onwards, it has had a powerful influence on later Scandinavian literatures, not in merely by the stories it contains but also by the visionary force and dramatic quality of many of the poems. It has also become an inspiring model for many later innovations in poetic meter, particularly in Nordic languages, offering many varied examples of terse, stress-based metrical schemes working without any final rhyme by instead using alliterative devices and strongly concentrated imagery. Poets who have acknowledged their debt to the Codex Regius include Wilhelm Ekeland, August Strindberg, J.R.R. Tolkien, Ezra Pound, George Louis Borges, and Karen Boyer. Codex Regius was written in the 13th century, but nothing is known of its whereabouts until 1643, when it came into the possession of Brynjolfur Sveinsson, then Bishop of Skálholt. At the time, versions of the Edda were known in Iceland, but scholars speculated that there once was another Edda, an Elder Edda, which contained the pagan poems that Snorri quotes in his Edda. When Codex Regius was discovered, it seemed that the speculation had proved, but modern scholarly research has shown that Edda was likely written first and the two were, at most, connected by a common source. Brynjolfur attributed the manuscript to Sigmund the Learned, a larger-than-life 12th-century Icelandic priest. That attribution is rejected by modern scholars, but the name Sigmundar Edda is still sometimes associated with both the Codex Regius and versions of Poetic Edda, using it as a source. Bishop Brynjolfur sent Codex Regius as a present to the Danish king, which gave the name. For centuries, it was stored in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, but in 1971, it was returned to Iceland. Composition. The Eddic poems are composed in alliterative verse. Most are in 4 near this lag, while Malahatta is a common variation. The rest, about a quarter, are composed in Yodhatta. The language of the poems is usually clear and relatively unadorned. Cannings are often employed, though they do not arise as frequently, nor are they as complex as those found in skaldic poetry. Authorship. Like most early poetry, the Eddic poems were minstrel poems, passing orally from singer to singer and from poet to poet for centuries. None of the poems are attributed to a particular author, though many of them show strong individual characteristics and are likely to have been the work of individual poets. Scholars sometimes speculate on hypothetical authors, but firm and accepted conclusions have never been reached. The dating of the poems has been a source of lively scholarly argument for a long time, and firm conclusions are hard to reach. Lines from the Eddic poems sometimes appear in poems by known poets, but such evidence is difficult to evaluate. For example, Eyvindr Skaldaspillir composed in the latter half of the 10th century, and he uses a couple of lines in his Hakonamál which are also found in Havamal. It is possible that he was quoting a known poem, but it is also possible that Havamal, or at least the strophe in question, is the younger derivative work. The few demonstrably historical characters mentioned in the poems, such as Attila, provide a terminus post-quem of sorts. The dating of the manuscripts themselves provides a more useful terminus ante-quem. Individual poems have individual clues to their age. For example, Atlamal in Greenland's Ku is claimed by its title to have been composed in Greenland, and seems to by some internal evidence. If so, it can be no earlier than about 985, since there were no Scandinavians in Greenland until that time. In some cases, old poems may have been interpolated with younger verses merged with other poems. For example, stanzas 9 to 16 of Völuspá, the Vögætál or roster of dwarfs, is considered by some scholars to be an interpolation. Location. The problem of dating the poems is linked with the problem of finding out where they were composed. Iceland was not settled until about 870, so anything composed before that time would necessarily have been elsewhere, most likely in Scandinavia. Any young poems, on the other hand, are likely Icelandic in origin. Scholars have attempted to localize individual poems by studying the geography, flora and fauna to which they refer. This approach usually does not yield firm results. For example, there are no wolves in Iceland, but we can be sure that Icelandic poets were familiar with the species. Similarly, the apocalyptic descriptions of Völuspá have been taken as evidence that the poet who composed it had seen a volcanic eruption in Iceland, but this is hardly certain. Additions and inclusions. Some poems similar to those found in Codex Regius are also included in some editions of the Poetic Edda. Important manuscripts include AM 748I42, Hauksbók and Flateyjarbók. Many of the poems are quoted in Snorri's Edda, but usually only in bits and pieces. What poems are included in an edition of the Poetic Edda depends on the editor. Those not in Codex Regius are sometimes called Eddicomenora from their appearance in an edition with that title edited by Andreas Hüsler and Wilhelm Ranisch in 1903. English translators are not consistent on the translations of the names of the Eddic poems or on how the Old Norse forms should be rendered in English. Up to 3 translations are given below, taken from the translations of Bellows, Hollander, and Larrington, with proper names in the normalized English forms found in John Lindau's Norse mythology and in Andy Orchard's Castle's Dictionary of Norse Myth and Legend. Mythological poems in Codex Regius. Völuspá have Mal, the Vafthrudnismal, Grimnismal, Skirnismal, Harborðsljóð, Hymiskvitha, Likasena, Thrimskvitha, Volandarkvitha, Alvismal. Not in Codex Regius. Balder's Drama, Grottasong, Rigsthula, Hindljoth. Völuspá in Skama. This poem, sometimes presented separately, is often included as an interpolation within Hindljoth. Svupdagsmal. This title, originally suggested by Bugger, actually covers 2 separate poems. These poems are late works and not included in most editions after 1950. Grogalda Fjolsvinnsmal, Rifnigalda Othens. Heroic lays. After the mythological poems, Codex Regius continues with heroic lays about mortal heroes. The heroic lays are to be seen as a whole in the Edda, but they consist of 3 layers: the story of Helgi Hungdingsbarni, the story of the Nibelungs, and the story of Jormunreka, king of the Goths. These are, respectively, Scandinavian, German, and Gothic in origin. As far as historicity can be ascertained, Attila, Jormunreka, and Brynhilda actually existed, taking Brynhilda to be partly based on Brunhilda of Austrasia, but the chronology has been reversed in the poems. In Codex Regius, the Helgi lays Helgigvitha Hungdingsbarna I Volsungagvitha, Helgigvitha Hjorvarthsna, Helgigvitha Hungdingsbarna Tua Volsungagvitha in Fauna. The Niflung cycle fra Dorthasinfjotla, Gripaspa, Reginsmal, Fanismal, Sigdrifumal, Brot af Sigurthakvithu, Guthrunark Vitherai, Sigurthark Vitherhinskama, Helrith Brynhilda, Drapniflunga, Guthrunark Vither 2, Guthrunark Vither 3, Odrunargrata, Adlakvither. The full manuscript title is Atlakvither Hindgrainlandska, that is, the Greenland Lay of Atli, but editors and translators generally omit the Greenland reference as a probable error from confusion with the following poem, Atlamal Hindgrainlandsku. The Jormanreka lays Guthrunarvat, Hamthismal, not in Codex Regius. Several of the legendary sagas contain poetry in the Eddic style. Its age and importance is often difficult to evaluate, but the Hervarar saga in particular contains interesting poetic interpolations. Lothsvitha, extracted from Hervarar saga. The Waking of Anganta, extracted from Hervarar saga. Allusions and quotations. As noted above, the Edda of Snorri Sturluson makes much use of the works included in the Poetic Edda, though he may well have had access to other compilations that contained the poems, and there is no evidence that he used the Poetic Edda or even knew of it. The Volsung Saga is a prose version of much of the Niflung cycle of poems. Due to several missing pages in the Codex Regius, the Volsung Saga is the oldest source from the Norse version of much of the story of Sigurd. Only 4 stanzas found on those pages are still extant, all of which are quoted in the Volsung Saga. J.R.R. Tolkien, a philologist familiar with the Eddas, utilized concepts in his 1937 fantasy novel The Hobbit. His misty mountains derive from the Urugfjall in the Skirnismal. The names of his dwarves derive from the Vigatal in the Voluspa. Bibliography in reverse chronological order. Original text Neckel, Gustav. Edda, Die Lieder des Codex Regius nebst verwandten Denkmalern. Text. Heidelberg, Winter, Vienna. Corrections by Fabrizio Ducci. Titus version by Jost Gippert. Available at Titus Text Collection. Edda. Closing parenthesis. John Helgeson. Edda Digte. Copenhagen. Mungsgard. Edda Digte. Nordisk Philologi 4 in 7-8. Copenhagen. Mungsgard. Finnur Johnson. De Gammel Edda Digte. Copenhagen. Gads. Boer. R.C. Die Edda mit historisch kritischem Kommentar Einleitung und Text. Haarlem. Willingen Amp. Zun. Huesler, Andreas and Amp. Ranisch. Wilhelm. Edeka Menora. Dortmund. Wimmer Ian Amp. Finnur Johnson. Handschrift at near 2365 40 GL. KGL. Samling par det Store KGL. Bibliothek Copenhagen I Fototypisk Diplomatisk Genguivels. Copenhagen. Samfund til Udgivelset Gammel Nordisk Litteratur. Bugger. Sophis. Siemendar Edda, Christiania, Pt. Malling, Munch, P.A., Den Eldre Edda, Samling af Norrøne Oldvad. Christiania, Pt. Malling, Sanionet, Eddic Poetry. Original text with English translation Dronki, Ursula. The Poetic Edda, Volume I. Heroic Poems, Oxford, Clarendon, ISBN 0-19811497-4. The Poetic Edda, Volume 2. Mythological Poems, Oxford, Clarendon, ISBN 0-1981111819. Bray, Olive. The Elder Poetic Edda, commonly known as Seaman's Edda, Part 1. The Mythological Poems, Viking Club Translation Series, Volume 2. London. Printed for the Viking Club. Reprinted 1982, New York, AMS Press. ISBN 0-404-60012-3. Gudbrand Vigfusson and Amp. Powell, F. York. Corpus Poeticum Boreale. The Poetry of the Old Northern Tongue. Oxford. Oxford University Press. Reprinted 1965, New York. Russell and Amp. Russell. Reprinted 1965, Oxford, Clarendon. translations from Volume 1 issued in Lawrence S. Thompson, Norse Mythology, the Elder Edda in prose translation. Hamden, C.N., Archon Books, ISBN 0208013946. English translation only. Crawford, Jackson. The Poetic Edda, Stories of the Norse Gods and Heroes. Indianapolis, Hackett Publishing Company, Inc. ISBN 1-624663567. Dodds, Jeremy. The Poetic Edda, Toronto, Coach House Books. ISBN 1-552452964. Orchard, Andy. The Elder Edda, A Book of Viking Lore. London, Penguin Group. ISBN 0140435859. Larrington, Carolyn. The Poetic Edda, Oxford World's Classics. Oxford, Oxford University Press. ISBN 0-19282383-3. Terry, Patricia. Poems of the Elder Edda. Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press. ISBN 0812282353. Hardcover. ISBN 0812282205. Paperback. Auden, W. H. and Amp. Taylor, Paul B. Norse Poems. London, Athlone. ISBN 0485112264. Also issued 1983. London, Faber. ISBN 0571130283. Terry, Patricia. Poems of the Vikings, the Elder Edda. Indianapolis, Indiana. Bobbs Merrill. ISBN 0672603322. Auden, W. H. and Amp. Taylor, Paul B. The Elder Edda, US Selection. London, Faber. ISBN 0571090664. Issued in 1970. New York, Random House. ISBN 0394706013. Also issued 1975. Bridgeport, CN. Associated Booksellers. ISBN 0571103197. Hollander, Lee M. The Poetic Edda, translated with an introduction and explanatory notes. Austin, Texas. University of Texas Press. ISBN 0292764995. Bellows, Henry Adams. The Poetic Edda, translated from the Icelandic with an introduction and notes. New York, American Scandinavian Foundation. Reprinted Lewiston, NY, Edwin Mellon Press. ISBN 0889467838. Thorpe, Benjamin. Ed. Siemund R. Hinsfrother, The Edda of Siemund the Learned. London, Trubner and Amp Co. 1866. Reprinted 1906 as The Elder Eddas of Siemund in Rasmus B. Anderson and Amp. J. W. Buell. The Elder Eddas of Siemund Sigfusson, Tr. From the original Old Norse text into English by Benjamin Thorpe, and the Younger Eddas of Snorri Sturluson, Tr. From the original Old Norse text into English by I. A. Blackwell. Norröna, The History and Romance of Northern Europe. London, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Berlin, New York, Norröna Society. Kottel, A.S. Icelandic Poetry of the Edda of Siemund. Bristol, N. Biggs. Commentary Lafarge, Beatrice and Amp. Tucker, John. Glossary to the Poetic Edda based on Hans Kuhn's Kurz's Waterbuck. Heidelberg. Glendinning, Robert J. and Amp. Besserson, Harolda. Edda, a collection of essays. Winnipeg, MB, University of Manitoba.